Back to the Finding Something Real podcast, friend. This is your host, Janelle Wood, and we are so glad that you are listening in for season 7. Throughout this year on this podcast, several different young women from various backgrounds have been sharing their stories and big questions or objections about faith here for conversation. And together we invite Christian guests to join us for further conversations about the issues and the questions that they share. As I've shared before, I'm a Christian and I found the real thing in Jesus Christ, and I want others to find that too. But I don't want you as a listener or watcher to take my word for it. For yourself, read about these things in the Bible and look into it. And each week we talk about whether the best things in life, restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love can ultimately be found in relationship with Jesus Christ. You are currently listening to an episode that's dedicated to Dagmar, who couldn't be here today.
I don't know, maybe 12 of us were just sitting/standing around like a high table. And I just went up to the front part of the table. Remember, I am the eldest of the entire class. Like most of them are 16, 17. I'm 22. I just went
But
on
you were the baby of your family.
I was the baby of most of my classes. So I went up, I put my arms down, I said, some of you know this, but I did a podcast with about Christianity. I was wondering, do any of you have any questions? Because I'm all out. And they were like, no, I don't know. I was like, oh, well, think harder. And then eventually some questions came up.
But in her stead is a familiar person. You won't get to see her face because she doesn't like her face being shown on video, but she is just so precious to me. She's been on this podcast multiple times, co-hosting some important conversations. She has quite a journey with Jesus already. And I'm just really, really grateful that she's here. Welcome back, Signe from Denmark. Signe, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for always welcoming me back. I've been here a few times now. Never gets old.
Now, you told me you were excited about today's conversation, and I think you mean it. What are you excited about?
Well, you said some things that I've never heard about, like in your notes. Well, about why Jesus wasn't coming back, I think. What was it about exactly? I think so.
A question about...
I want to know. I've never heard that question.
He's taken a while. Why is it taking so long? It's a question I've heard before, and it's something that I've wrestled with, and it was something I wanted to ask today's guest. And then also the resurrection, we wanted to ask him about that. Do you mind sharing a little bit of where you're at with faith before we introduce today's guest?
Is that what yeah, well, so I don't really know where to start. Well, I think I've realized, I don't know how to put it. I've realized that Jesus is real. I can't really deny it. And I'm slowly changing my life a little bit and accepting that I do believe that he's real and that I have to change my life, but I'm doing it at my own pace. I'm not quite ready to fully dive in, but I'm getting there.
Well, I'm excited for you to visit in a couple months, and so I can give you a hug and we can have long walks and conversations, and the kind where we cry like we used to do. But today, I'm really excited to introduce guest because we get to ask him if he hasn't discussed these questions with us today. William Lane Craig is a research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada, California. Dr. Craig's an international lecturer and debater. He has presented to numerous audiences in North America, Europe, and Asia, and he is known for his skillful communication to both scholar and student alike. In 2016, Dr. Craig was named by the Best Schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers, and he's been cited by other guests on this podcast many times. Welcome to the Finding Something Real podcast, Dr. Craig.
Thank you, Janelle. Great to be with you.
And Dr. Craig, I know I asked you this before we hit record, but is it okay if I just call you Bill?
Sure.
Before you came on this podcast, Bill, I watched quite a few of your videos. I was really impressed by some of your debates. I have heard and watched your stuff before. I even showed you before we hit record of this book that Alan Krostick recommended I get, and it's been helpful. But I had never heard your personal story of coming to faith before. And since I am more of a feeler, I would love to hear about where you came from. How did Jesus get a hold of your heart?
I wasn't raised in a Christian family or even a church-going home, though it was a good and loving family. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And in the search for answers, I began to attend a large church in our community, all on my own. The only problem was that instead of answers, what I found instead was a sort of social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate, and the other high school students who pretended to be such good Christians on Sunday lived the rest of the week incredibly immoral lives. And this really bothered me because I thought, here I am so spiritually empty inside, but externally, at least, I'm leading a better life than they are, and they claim to be Christians. They're all just a pack of hypocrites. And so I began to be very angry and alienated from the institutional church because of the phoniness and the hypocrisy that I saw there. And pretty soon this attitude of mine began to spread toward other people. Everybody, I thought, is holding up a plastic mask to the world while the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so I began to become very hateful and resentful toward people in general for their hypocrisy and phoniness. And I said, I don't need people. I don't want anything to do with people. And I threw myself into my studies. But at the same time, in moments of introspection and honesty, when I looked deep inside myself, I knew that deep down inside, I really did want to love and to be loved by others. And I realized in that moment that I was just as much a hypocrite as they were, because here I was putting on this brave face, pretending not to need people, when deep down inside, I knew that I really did. And so that anger turned in upon myself for my own hypocrisy and phoniness. And I don't know if you understand what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just eats away at your insides day after day, making every day miserable, just another day to get through. And I remember one day I was feeling particularly crummy, and I walked into my high school German class, and I sat down behind a girl who's one of these types, that is always so happy, it just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, it's because I'm saved. And I said, you're what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with anger and hate. And she said there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought just staggered me, to think that the God of the universe could love me, Bill Craig, that worm down there on that speck of dust called planet Earth. I just couldn't take it in. Well, I went home that night and I found a New Testament that had been given to me when the Gideons, a Bible society, visited our grade school in the 5th grade, handing out New Testaments. And for the first time, I opened it and began to read it. And as I did, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about his words that I had never encountered before, but especially there was an authenticity about his life that wasn't characteristic of those people who claimed to be his followers in that local church I was attending. And I realized at that time I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And as I read the New Testament, I realized what my problem was, my own sin, the wrong things that I had thought and said and done had ruptured the relationship with God that I was created to have, so that I was alienated from God. It was no wonder that God seemed so unreal to me. But the good news of the New Testament was that God had sent his Son into the world to die for me, to pay the penalty for my sin, so that my sins could be forgiven and I could be restored to that relationship with God that I was created to have. Well, to make a long story short, I went through about 6 months of the most intense soul searching that I'd ever been through in my life. And at the end of those 6 months, I just came to the end of my rope. And one night, I just cried out to God. And I cried out all of the anger and the bitterness that had been building up inside of me. And at the same time, I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I remember I rushed outside. It was a warm Midwestern September evening. And as I looked up at the sky, I could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. And as I looked at the stars, I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my whole life, because I had thought enough about this during those 6 months to realize that if this was really the truth, if it was really the truth, then I could do nothing else than dedicate my entire life to spreading this message among mankind, because this is the greatest news ever announced. And so for me, Janelle, my call to full-time Christian ministry was simultaneous with my conversion.
Wow. Signe, you want to respond to that before I ask the next question?
No, I just think it's cool how you found it all on your own. I mean, I distanced myself from it first before I wanted to know more, because I was a little bit scared of it, but I think it's really cool that you were so brave to do it all by yourself.
It wasn't really on my own. I owe an eternal debt of gratitude to Sandy Tiffin, who sat in front of me in German class and who had the courage to share with this angry young man her faith in Jesus Christ. And so God used her.
It's one thing to come to faith. It's another thing to go around the world sharing about that faith with people who don't share your opinions. And you've gotten a lot of flack for some of the things that you've shared about the Lord. Can you share a little bit about that trajectory from that night on September where you're like, okay, I need to tell people about this. This is amazing. My life has been filled with joy, to I'm the only Christian. And now I'm set free into the world. How did that happen?
Yeah. Since I came from a non-Christian family and all my friends were non-Christians, I was immediately faced with the challenge of explaining to them why I had made this radical change in my life. And so right from the start, I was interested in giving reasons for faith. And when I graduated from high school 2 years later, I attended Wheaton College, which is a Christian liberal arts college. And at Wheaton, the emphasis was on the integration of faith and learning. I learned at Wheaton that I didn't need to stick my faith in one pocket and my brains in the other pocket and never let them see the light of day at the same time. But rather, as a Christian, I could have a Christian perspective on the world, a Christian perspective on the arts, on sciences, on history, on literature, and so forth. And it was at Wheaton that I conceived this vision of sharing the gospel in the context of presenting an intellectual defense of the Christian faith. And so that's how that ministry, in a sense, came to be. It was through that educational experience at Wheaton. Now, in high school and college, I participated in 8 years of high school and intercollegiate debate activities. This was not a religious exercise. This was an exercise in political and social thought. We would debate political topics, but I was no good at athletics, but I could compete for my school on the university or high school debate team. And when I graduated from college, I thought, well, my debating days are over now. It was a great run, but never again. And then I began to receive invitations from Canadian campus groups inviting me to participate in debates with humanists and atheists and other secular scholars on topics like, does God exist? Or who was Jesus? Or humanism versus Christianity. And what I discovered was that hundreds and even thousands of students would come out to watch one of these debates. And so it became very clear to me that the forum for evangelism on the university campus today is debate. And so that was how I got into this public ministry of arguing for the Christian faith and answering objections to it.
Were you scared to do that? And do you ever feel nervous when you step out on the stage in front of all those people and you're the representative of something so important?
There's a healthy nervousness that I think everybody who is in some sort of performance art, whether it be public speaking or figure skating or whatever, feels. But that goes away very quickly. As I say, I was well trained in debate, and the key to good debating is preparation. It is to be so thoroughly prepared that you have anticipated every objection that your opponent could raise to your view, as well as any arguments that he might present for his view and how you would respond to those arguments. So the actual goal of preparation is not to have to think on your feet. You don't want to have to think on your feet in a debate and respond off the cuff. You want to be so well prepared that you've got all your responses and arguments well in hand when you go into it. And so that helps to give a person, I think, a sense of confidence and calm in going into these public forums.
Well, I watched one debate where you were talking to this gentleman, and I can't remember the name of the guy you were talking to, but he was leaning back in his chair, chilled. He was talking about what it would take for him to believe in the miracles, an angel coming down and lightning and all these different things. And he had just been talking about hallucination, and you had like this mic drop moment, and it was so, it was classic. Do you feel like there's an added stress that you have to deal with?
Well, there's an added responsibility. I am acutely aware when I go into a public forum that I am a public representative of Jesus Christ, and that therefore I need to evince his character and love toward my opponent. And that includes, for example, turning the other cheek if you're insulted and not attacking the other person personally. And so I pray prior to these events that the Lord would give me his spirit of gentleness and compassion toward my opponent as well as toward hostile people in the audience, because it is just as important how you say something and how you behave as what you say in these events.
just one more question on that. When I know I feel this way with the podcast, right? I pray before every podcast recording, gave it to the Lord. I asked for his help, and then I walk forward in that confidence. Do you ever have times where you're like, oh man, I wish I would have done it differently? And how do you just walk in the grace of, hey, that's part of like, this is life?
That happens rarely. There have been cases where I felt I could have done better. I didn't express it so well, or my argument wasn't as good. And so what I will often do is a kind of post-mortem, like a fifth quarter, where the football team will watch the films of the game and the coach will talk about it and how it could have been done differently or improved. And so I'll do that as well to try to learn from these things and to try to improve and do it better. But generally speaking, I'm so thoroughly prepared that I don't usually have regrets about the arguments that I gave or what I said. I want to say to Signe, that I've had some wonderful debates in Denmark with Danish philosophers in Copenhagen and in Aalborg. And there are some very fine Christian philosophers in Denmark at the University of Aalborg, like Peter Østrøm and others. And so we've had wonderful experiences in Denmark, and these debates are on YouTube if you want to look at them. Now they're in English, not Danish, obviously, but nevertheless, it was a privilege to debate in front of Danish audiences.
It's funny because religion in Denmark is not very talked about or discussed about among ourselves. So it's not something like cross a lot. So for me, it's been very like how do I want to tell people? But it's fun to know because I actually don't know a lot about like Christian philosophers because they're not like in the news or anything. It's not. Right. They're not like well known within their own country, I think.
Yes, I appreciate that fact very much, which is one reason I wanted all the more to accept this invitation and to be there.
Do you mind sharing about some of the highlights of the resurrection? What are some things that you love to point out?
I did my doctoral studies at the University of Munich in Germany on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. And I was stunned, frankly, to discover that the facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus are agreed to today by the vast majority of New Testament historians who have written on this subject. And I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about conservative Christian scholars. I'm talking about the broad mainstream of professional New Testament scholarship. And we can list these facts as 5 in number. First of all would be that Jesus of Nazareth was executed by Roman crucifixion during the Passover feast. Secondly, that his corpse was then interred in a tomb by a member of the Jewish high court named Joseph of Arimathea. Thirdly is that a group of Jesus' female disciples discovered that tomb to be empty on the Sunday morning following Jesus' crucifixion. Fourth, then various individuals and groups of people had experiences of seeing Jesus alive after his death. And finally, number 5, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite every predisposition to the contrary. Now, those are the facts, and they are agreed upon by the vast majority of New Testament historians today. And my argument would be that I can't think of any better explanation of those 5 facts than the one that the original disciples gave, namely, God raised Jesus from the dead. This element, the 5th fact, has been especially emphasized by the British New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, who has shown that the original disciples, very soon after the crucifixion of Jesus, came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead sincerely, such that they were willing to go to horrible deaths for the truth of that belief. And that this belief contradicted fundamental Jewish beliefs in several different ways. As I say, they had every predisposition against this belief. Number one, their leader was dead. And Jews had no concept of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over the enemies of Israel and establishing the throne of David in Jerusalem, would be humiliated and defeated by his enemies and crucified like a common criminal. Much less was there any connection between Messiah and rising from the dead. Secondly, Jesus' crucifixion as a criminal showed him to be, according to Old Testament law, a man who was under the curse of God. The crucifixion was such an unmitigated disaster for these disciples, not simply because their beloved master was gone, but rather because the crucifixion showed Jesus to be, according to Old Testament law, a man under the curse of God. In other words, for 3 years, they had been following a heretic. The Jewish chief priests and Pharisees had been right all along. And number 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection after the end of the world. The Jewish belief in resurrection was always belief in a corporate resurrection of the dead that would take place on the judgment day after the end of the world. They had no concept of a resurrection of an isolated individual occurring within human history. So, confronted with Jesus' crucifixion and death, the disciples basically had 2 choices. Either they went home or they got themselves a new Messiah. But the idea of the belief that he was the Messiah after all and God had raised him from the dead was completely contrary to first century Jewish beliefs. And so right across the first century before Christ and the first century after Christ, there were many would-be messiahs, and the Romans dispatched them all in the same way. And in no case do we find any of these messianic groups saying that their crucified leader was in fact the Messiah after all. And yet this is what these earliest Christians suddenly and sincerely came to believe. And that requires some sort of an explanation, that the resurrection, as it has been put, rips a hole in the middle of history in the first century, a hole the size and shape of the resurrection. And so for anyone who denies the resurrection as a historical event, he's got to find some alternative explanation for plugging up that hole. And I can't think of any explanation that is as good as the one the disciples gave.
If you came to one of your parents and you said, I'm a Christian now, do you think that they'd have a question? What his question might be?
Well, I don't think it would be about the resurrection, actually. I don't think they're that much into it. Sometimes I ask them, but I think the most part for them is that they just don't understand why. Why would I want to be a Christian? Why would I want to believe in Jesus? And I keep telling them that it's going to save me. And I think it's because mostly they see that it's hard for me. I think my mom has been, and it's actually made and she doesn't understand why I would like do something that is hard. And I think that's the bigger part, and they don't really understand a lot about the Christianity and all that stuff. So I don't think, like, for me too, like, I didn't even think about it would be false if if the resurrection didn't happen, it would all be false. You know? I think it wasn't until I knew a lot more about the whole picture itself that I thought about it that way. Because I don't know how to explain this, but when I came to you and I started having questions about it, the resurrection like often comes up because people keep saying that if the resurrection didn't happen, then all it would be false. But I don't think a lot of people like goes directly to the resurrection and like wants to have that explained.
It was difficult for me to understand everything Signe said because your voice is so soft and gentle. But what I got from that is she says, if I'm not mistaken, that the resurrection isn't just on most people's radar screens.
No.
Is that right? That they're not really asking questions about something like that. And so this would be very foreign to them, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, it's more like they don't see the point in even like diving into it, you know? If you want to go like look at the resurrection, you have to dive into Christianity at first. Like, what is it at all? Like the whole. And I don't think a lot of people, especially around here in Denmark, I mean, it's probably very different, like from where you are at. But here, it's just like there's a religion, and you're like, you recognize that there is one, but why would you want to know more? Because you're satisfied. And I think my parents, for me bringing it up, are actually just more hurt that I'm telling them that they might live wrong than they wanting to know more.
I mean, obviously, in sharing the gospel with people, this is supposed to be good news, so that it ought not to bring pain. It ought to bring tremendous hope, joy, meaning to life, hope beyond the grave for eternal life. So this is, I think, a wonderful message of hope and happiness for folks to hear, and not something that's hurtful for them. And it should be presented as such.
I really wanted to know, I think that was a question that drew me in, if Jesus is coming back, you know, or God is coming back, you know, to this planet.
Yes, this is a very difficult question. There are passages in the Gospels where it suggests that Jesus is going to return soon. Now, at the same time, it's important to understand that there are many other parables that Jesus gives that talk about how the delay will be long. He gives the parable, for example, of the bride and the brides and the bridegroom, where the bridegroom is delayed in returning, and some of their lights or their lamps go out as they're waiting for him. There are many other parables that do talk about this long delay. So there's balance on both sides. And Jesus himself said, I do not know the time of my return. He said, the time of my return is known only to my Father in heaven. So even though Jesus, I think, wanted us to have a sense that his return could be imminent in our lives, he himself wouldn't be so bold as to say when it would occur. And there are parables that suggest it may be delayed considerably. So the really difficult passages are only about 2 in number, where Jesus seemed to suggest that some of the people listening to him will not die before he returns, and that he's going to return during this very generation. There's only a couple of passages like that that are difficult to understand. And my argument would be that the original context in which these statements were made by Jesus may have been very different from the context in which they are recorded in the Gospels, so that it creates a false impression that he's going to come back during the lifetime of the witnesses. And I think a great example of this is his discourse to the 70 as he sends them out on mission throughout Israel. And if you read that mission discourse to the 70, what you discover is that Matthew has moved some of the material about the return of the Son of Man at the close of the age, and he's inserted it into the missionary discourse so that it makes it sound as if Jesus is predicting that before they return from their mission to Israel, the second coming is going to happen. And yet we know that's not what Matthew thought, because Matthew records the return of the 70 and the second coming didn't occur. So it is a false impression created by Matthew's moving these predictions of the end and placing them in the missionary discourse, so that Jesus says, before you have gone through all of the towns of Israel, the Son of Man will return. And we know that Matthew didn't mean that, and Jesus didn't mean that. So I think that given the fact that the gospel writers will often move the sayings of Jesus about and record them in different contexts, this impression that Jesus was going to return during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses is simply a misimpression that arises because the sayings have been put in a different context than Jesus originally gave them.
Do you think he's coming back soon?
Do I? No. Not soon in terms of my lifetime. I don't see that the signs are right. The temple hasn't even been rebuilt in Jerusalem, so I don't see that the signs of the time indicate that this is going to happen within my lifetime or this century. Now, of course, I could be completely wrong. It could be that some of these signs are metaphorical in nature rather than literal. Jesus said when he returns, it's going to catch everybody by surprise. They're not going to be expecting it. And that could include me. So although I'm not expecting it within my lifetime or soon, I want to be prepared in case it does happen, so that, as Jesus says, it's not as though I'm caught like by a thief in the night coming to rob me.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, because throughout the ages, people have believed he's coming in their lifetime. And
oh, yes, every generation.
But it feels like the world is getting really rough. But I guess everyone's felt that beforehand and will feel it afterwards as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of my parents' generation, who would have been a better candidate for the Antichrist than Adolf Hitler with the Holocaust that he pursued against the Jews and his ambition to take over the world and establish a 1,000-year Reich? I mean, if anybody would seem to have been a good candidate for fulfilling these end-time prophecies, it would have been Adolf Hitler. And yet we know that he wasn't. He was the spirit of the Antichrist, perhaps, but he wasn't the fulfillment of these end-time prophecies.
Is this something that atheist scholars will debate you? Well, if Jesus is the real deal, why hasn't he come back yet? Is that something that you hear a lot, or is it something that church people come up to you and say?
Never. Yeah, it's never brought up, interestingly enough. And I think the reason for that is that it's tangential. It's not at the heart of the issue of who Jesus was. The core, the heart of this is who he believed himself to be. What were his radical personal claims? And then the credibility of his resurrection from the dead. Because if God has raised this man from the dead, then he must have been who he claimed to be. And the God he had allegedly blasphemed has publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims. And then the issue of the predictions of his return just takes on secondary importance. It's a puzzle to think about, but it doesn't strike at the heart of who Jesus claimed to be or the historicity of his resurrection.
Good. So you're obviously a person who thinks a lot. Do you ever have your own doubts that you have to wrestle with, or questions that you have to wrestle with? And how do you deal with those?
Sure. Every person who is a thinking Christian has unanswered questions that he struggles with. And in moments of doubt, I think there are two things that we should do. One is we should seek to draw near to the Lord in worship and prayer. The Bible gives us the promise, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. And so we must never treat doubt as a purely intellectual issue. There is a spiritual dimension to this that needs to be addressed as well. And so we need to be sure there's no unconfessed sin in our lives, and we need to be sure that we're walking in the power and the fullness of God's Holy Spirit. And then secondly, I think it's very helpful to review the arguments and evidence that go to support the Christian faith. And this is especially valuable in times of spiritual dryness, when your relationship with the Lord isn't as vibrant as you would like, and he seems perhaps distant. Then looking again at the arguments for God's existence and the evidence for who Jesus was can be a tremendous encouragement for faith and perseverance. And I must say, honestly, in all honesty, when I review the arguments for God's existence and the evidence for the person of Christ, I just shake my head and say, these are really good arguments. These really are convincing. I am convinced by this. So even in moments of doubt or struggle, I think that the evidence carries the day.
I have two final questions. What do you want to be remembered for, Dr. Craig? If you get older and you've been in ministry for a long time, what is it you want people to remember about you and what you've done and the work that you've put out there and who you are as a person?
Wow. I suppose I want to leave a legacy of published works in defense of the Christian faith that will be used not just for decades, but even centuries from now. I hope that the books and the articles that I am publishing in support of the truth of Christianity will outlive me and will be remembered after I'm gone.
All right. Final question. We always ask this question of people. The Finding Something Real podcast journey towards restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. All things that we can find in relationship with Jesus Christ. Restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. Which of those four things stands out to you the most in your life right now, and why?
Okay, now it was restoration,
eternity,
authenticity, what else?
And love.
Eternity, love. Boy, I suppose eternity is the most important for me. I think that death puts a question mark behind the meaning and significance of anything we do, and indeed of the human race itself. If the human race is destined to peter out someday in the heat death of the universe, at some far point in the distant future, then it just seems to me that nothing matters, because no matter what we do, what we think, everything will turn out the same. And so the prospect of eternal life, I think, is a hope that imbues this life with tremendous meaning and significance. It means that every day I wake up, I have things to do that are of eternal, everlasting significance. And man, does that give you a motivation and reason for living. So the hope of eternity, I think, is probably for me the most fundamental and meaningful.
Well, Dr. William Lane Craig.
Now, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
How do most of your other guests answer that question? Which one of those
They pick
do
them
they
all.
pick?
I don't
they?
know that
Okay.
I've had one that sticks out more than any of the others, to tell you the truth, which has been really interesting over the 4.5 years I've been doing this.
Yeah, that is interesting. So some other people have said eternity as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Good. Okay.
You're not the only one with that in mind. I appreciate it. And Dr. William Lane Craig, Signe, thank you both so much for being here. Until next time.